Good afternoon. We are glad you've decided to join us for the fourth and final session of our Aging in Place series. Today's webinar is titled An Emotional Guide to Planning for Caregiving. We have received great interest and feedback in the whole series, and we hope you have also found it valuable. All the sessions have been hosted by the Newton-Wellesley Hospital Community Health Department. Newton-Wellesley Hospital Community Health is dedicated to improving the health and wellness of those who live in the area we serve and focuses on addressing health and socioeconomic needs by enhancing medical services and resources throughout our community. Through initiatives that include access to healthcare, prevention, and intervention, the hospital is making a difference in the cities and towns in which we live and work. A significant part of these efforts is through our 8 councils within the Newton-Wellesley Hospital Community Collaborative. These councils strive to make compelling impact in all areas related to overall health and well-being. They include domestic and sexual abuse, elder care, heart health and wellness, maternity services, palliative care, youth mental health, substance use, and workforce development. Please feel free to visit the Newton-Wellesley Hospital website at www.nwh.org to learn more or get involved. In addition, the community programs we are offering this fall are listed on our website. We encourage you to register for any of those that are of interest to you and to also share them with family and friends. Before the program officially starts, I'd like to mention a few logistics. We will be leaving plenty of time for questions and answers and would ask that you use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to type your questions in. Our speaker will respond to the questions at the end of the portion where she was doing the presentation. And now let me tell you a bit about today's presenter, Julie Norstrand. Julie holds a master's in social work and clinical psychology. She also completed her PhD and founded her company, Help My Aging Parents. Julie has worked in the aging field for the last 20 years, and I'm really going to leave it to her to tell you more about herself. Thank you for joining.
Lauren, thank you so much for the introduction. And I do just want to say I've enjoyed doing this 4-part series so much. So thank you. So hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Julie Norstrand. And today my focus is going to be on the emotional dimension of caregiving. Many of you on this webinar today may also have attended the presentation that I did last week, which focus on the practical dimensions of caregiving. What I found so interesting was that many of the questions at the end of that session centered around the challenges that many experience with family members when talking about planning for elder care and the emotional stress that this all brings on. So I really hope that today's session will be helpful to you. Through my work consulting with families about planning for caregiving, as well as the caregiver support groups that I run, I've come to realize that caregiving is a very emotional journey, both rewarding and challenging. The rewarding aspects come from the time spent together with your loved one, which often results in getting to know them better in terms of their history, as well as who they are today. It can also be a time for making amends and clarifying misunderstandings that may have existed for years. But there are certainly also many challenges that caregivers experience. And it's these challenges that I'm going to focus on today. I think it's both important and helpful for people who are taking on this role to be aware of the challenges that they may be experiencing, and that so they can be better prepared for them and how to deal with them. So on this slide here, you see the different emotional challenges that many caregivers describe. Are there any of these emotions written here on this slide that you may recognize in yourself, I wonder? I've heard a lot of caregivers express these emotions over the years. Some time ago, a caregiver wrote to me about how he was coping. This was someone who was caring for his wife with Alzheimer's. And what he wrote was frustration, anger, sleep deprivation, anxiety, restricted activities, and separation from friends. So let those words just sink in for a second. When it comes to understanding these emotions, it's important to realize that many of these emotions often come tied together. So case in point, some time ago, a group of caregivers were saying how they often felt that they lost patience with their loved one and that this would then make them feel guilty. It's also important to realize that people may experience some of these emotions at different stages of caregiving. And indeed, these emotions may be especially strong for caregivers who are caring all alone, as it is much more challenging if you're doing this all by yourself. So for the rest of our time, what I'm going to be doing is focusing on these following key points. First, what does it mean to be a caregiver? And often you'll experience a transition. Then I'm going to be talking about caregiver stress syndrome in terms of the signs and symptoms and the importance of the impact on your health. Then I'll address typical emotional stresses that many caregivers experience. Then, very importantly, how to manage stress. Then I'll go on to talk about the services and resources for caregivers, where you might find these. And then finally, I hope the last slide will help you to get to a better place. So one of the many challenges in my line of work when trying to help caregivers is that often people don't define themselves as a caregiver. And this is especially true in the beginning stages of caregiving, where instead you may see yourself as the dutiful son or daughter or spouse. You're doing maybe some food shopping, you're fixing a loose doorknob, you're reminding them of an upcoming doctor's appointment. But eventually, you're more than that dutiful son, daughter, or spouse. You become the one that your parent or loved one relies on. In other words, you're their caregiver. And it's this reliance which is so critical in this relationship. And often this comes with challenges, stress, and time taken away from other responsibilities, including work, family, or your social life. As you're reflecting on where you might be in this transition, I wonder where you would put yourself at. Are you in that very early stage of thinking of yourself as, I'm just doing what is expected? Or do you now see yourself very much in that role of the caregiver? A huge issue for caregivers is caregiver stress syndrome, also known as burnout. There is one caregiver that truly exemplifies this for me, whom I will never forget. She was experiencing clear burnout. And this was about 3, maybe 4 years ago, where this person who I'd never met before suddenly called me out of the blue one evening. It was around 8:30, 9 o'clock in the evening. And she proceeded to tell me what was going on. She was living with her parents, both age 91. She was the sole caregiver. Siblings were not available. She was burning through her own retirement fund. The parents were very recluse and would not let anyone but her take care of them. And she hadn't slept in days. She was clearly burned out and experiencing multiple stresses. Now, at the end of that call, I remember she thanked me so much. And it was really just for listening. She needed someone to talk to and really hear her. I remember thinking to myself, I wonder how many thousands of other people, other caregivers are in her situation. And I hate to say that there are way too many caregivers out there who are in that similar situation as her. So my ask to you is, if you know someone who's a caregiver, please reach out to them, talk to them, let them express how they're feeling. They probably just need to be heard. And the way that caregiver stress syndrome manifests is in terms of extreme exhaustion. And that can be experienced physically, mentally, emotionally, and socially. And on this slide here, you see some typical ways that burnout manifests itself. And as you look through this list of signs and symptoms, you'll notice that some are of more physical nature, such as change in appetite and weight. Some are more emotional, such as irritability or sadness, as well as some which are more socially oriented, such as staying away from friends, isolating yourself, and stopping things that you enjoy doing. So in your own time, as you get a chance to review this list, it's important that you really think through as to which ones that you may recognize, because these are all important indicators for things that you may need to address. So as you can well imagine, the more stressed out you are, the greater the toll on your health. So here you see some outcomes based on some research done in this area. So for example, one meta-analysis found that when looking at depression amongst caregivers, that 40 to 70% of caregivers will indicate experiencing depression. Another study found that 45% of caregivers report chronic conditions such as heart attacks, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, arthritis, a whole host of chronic conditions. And then one study which looked at caregivers by age, and they found that caregivers aged 66 to 96 have a 63% higher mortality rate than those that are not caring. And one story that I want to give you that really gives you the immense impact that caregiving can have on the individually, both physically and emotionally, is one where I helped a family where the family approached me because the person who had been the primary caregiver had attempted suicide. And it was a shock to everyone. And they all acknowledged on the phone call how the fact that the individual had attempted suicide was clearly a cry for help. Ultimately, the stress had gotten so great that this primary caregiver had felt that their only option was to attempt suicide. So if you're asking yourself whether you should be concerned about stress, I hope that these numbers I've given you, as well as the story, really does help you understand why being aware of the stress level is critical for you and the ramifications that it may have on your health. So as you're here today on this call, some of you may already be experiencing some stress and worry about caregiving. And what I find is these three questions can be very helpful in terms of getting an understanding of where you're at. So the first question is, how anxious or stressed are you about expecting to become or being a caregiver? So from a range of 0 to 100, where might you put yourself? And just case in point, a small study that I did with about 50 caregivers, the average reported level of stress was at about 60. The second question is, what is causing your anxiety? And on the next slide, I will be talking more about typical scenarios that cause stress for caregivers, especially. And then the last one is, what are you doing to relieve your stress? Again, something that I will be talking about towards the end. I think this is a wonderful exercise to go through because the first thing is it helps you to acknowledge the stress that you're under by simply quantifying it. Second, it gets you to reflect on what it is that's really stressing you. What are the triggers that are related to caregiving? And here, in order for that to be helpful, I really encourage you to be as specific as possible about exactly what these triggers or stressors are. And the third point is that it may help you to reflect a little bit about what you might be doing already at this point in trying to de-stress yourself. And what you may be realizing as you go through this exercise is that maybe some of those coping mechanisms may not actually be the most helpful. So, for example, with some caregivers, they will acknowledge that, yes, they're eating more than they should. Maybe they're drinking too much. Maybe they're isolating. And possibly these coping mechanisms could help a little bit in the short run, but certainly not in the long run. So that's why it's important to really possibly think about additional or different types of coping mechanisms. But we will be talking about ways of dealing with stress later on in this webinar. So as I was just saying, it's important to understand what is causing your stress. What are your triggers? And here on this slide, you see many of the stresses that caregivers have reported to me. Some of them reflect more early on stress. So for example, what's making a person worried in the beginning may be that they realize that they have no plan in place, or they have no idea how to start. Also, for many, it involves not knowing how to start that conversation. That is so difficult because, as I said last week, this is just not a fun topic to start. Also, caregivers often stress about how to manage everything. So if they have a family with growing children and they're also working, that whole work-life balance can be extremely difficult to handle as the caregiver inevitably feels that they're being pulled in so many different directions. Self-doubt is another critical area I've found. For many, if they're suddenly having to manage chronic health conditions along with the typical caregiving duties such as food shopping, taking the loved one to a doctor's appointment, doing the bills and taxes, preparing meals, and so on. This whole new role that that individual is taking on can certainly be quite daunting. And recently I consulted with 3 siblings where the sister was going to be doing the hands-on taking care of the mom, and the 2 brothers were going to be there in a supportive role. And the sister, it became very clear on this call, was extremely anxious because she realized that she was now going to be having to provide some medical care for her mom. She was also worried about this idea of, was she going to be able to transport her mom to the toilet in the middle of the night, let's say? Or would she even be able to get her mom up if her mom was to fall? So it's really not difficult to imagine that the anxiety level for this sister and that self-doubt that she had in the very beginning. Lack of support is probably one of the biggest chronic conditions or scenarios that result in caregiver burnout. There are too many caregivers out there who are doing the caregiving on their own. And the monotony of caregiving can be grinding. Unlike with childcare, where generally you see growth, instead with elder care, you are often faced with someone who's both physically and potentially mentally deteriorating. Unfortunately, the lack of support is reflective of the fact that we are all having smaller families, and so there are less children to share the burden of care. And also the inability of many families to be able to afford paid care. Another area of stress is general family conflicts that occur due to disagreements about how care should be done. Who should be providing more support beyond the primary caregiver? What the care recipient really wants, what is in their best interest. And I'm going to be talking about this in more depth on the next slide, because I do know, based on the questions that I received last week, is that this is an area that is of concern for many. The last point I want to bring up that is an important stressor for many families and caregivers is the financial costs to the caregiver. And in a study done by AARP back in 2021 found that on average, families will pay about a little over $7,000 per year just in caregiving costs, such as paying for maybe the mortgage that their loved one still needs to pay, maybe the medications, and all the different factors that may need to be paid for as a caregiver. So, as I said, some of you may be experiencing challenges with family members about the care that your loved one, your parent, should receive. For example, there are many disagreements about whether is it time to move your loved one into assisted living or nursing home? And where's the best place to do this? Is it best to have your parent move closer to where you live? Or should you have them stay in the other state that they may be living in? That's certainly very challenging. There may be continued disagreements about who should be taking on various responsibilities. All of these tensions are things that I hear so often. And I will say this, that one of the things that I often reflect on with families is that these disagreements can often occur because each of us, whether we're the spouse, whether we're children, whether we're more distant family members such as nieces or siblings, tensions can occur because we have different relationships with different people. And so therefore that can result in misunderstandings or different perceptions. And it's so important to be aware of this, because that helps you to be at least aware that what you perceive may be different than your sibling or another family member that might be involved in this caregiving plan. And I would argue that for this very reason, I always encourage the parent or spouse who is looking for support from family members that they communicate what their needs and wishes are to everyone who may be involved in the care plan, ideally at the same time. In that way, you make sure that this message, the one message, is being heard by everyone at the same time. And this should hopefully reduce the likelihood of misunderstandings or hearing a different message. It can also be helpful when you sense ongoing challenges with family members to pinpoint exactly what the disagreements are about and try to figure out why these disagreements exist. where difference of opinion may be part of the reason why these disagreements exist. Ultimately, it's important to emphasize with each one of you, where you may have differences of opinion and disagreements, that your goal is the same. You all want what's best for your loved one. And I think if you can get to that point, then you start to be able to weed out the differences of disagreement a little bit more easily when you know that your ultimate goal is the same. Where the next part is important is trying to negotiate the difference roles and responsibilities. And just as an example, there was a family that I worked with some years ago where this was in regards to an 87-year-old mom who was living in a nursing home. And through a lot of conversations between the siblings, there were two sisters and a brother, they resolved the idea that the best way to support the mom was that the son, who lived in a different state than the mom, he would be doing more the financial stuff. So he would be doing, making sure how the money was being spent and the different people that needed to be paid were being paid on time. The two sisters who lived near the mom, they would be the ones going in to check on the mom in the nursing home to make sure that all her needs were being met. But ultimately, it was based on the fact that they were able to sit down and sort of delegate responsibilities according to what was feasible and also according to what probably their skill sets were. And for those of you who attended my webinar last week, you may recall I talked about the one way of allocating responsibilities is by doing it according to personal strengths. When there is conflict, I remind people to apply some good practices, which are pretty basic. One is really listen, and it might be helpful to provide feedback so that you can each make sure that you're hearing the same message. Also, demonstrate empathy and flexibility, because remember, things are changing all the time. And if a sibling had committed to doing task X, but can no longer do so because something has changed for them, then maybe you, as the primary caregiver who needs the support of that sibling, just realize that things may have changed for them, so their commitment may change. And then you just demonstrate flexibility. But I think flexibility is quite key in all of this because of that nature of it. Things changing, opinions changing, the needs of the loved one may be changing all the time. But ultimately, however, I will acknowledge that for some caregivers, they decide that trying to involve siblings or other people is just too contentious. And so they decide it is less stressful by going it alone. Still, in this scenario, what I do encourage the caregiver to do is maybe do maybe a weekly, maybe a monthly update email to the rest of the people. Maybe it's their other siblings, maybe it's, as I have said, any other individuals that may be part of this care plan. Give them updates about what's going on, because in that way, it enables them to step up at a later point if they feel that they can now step in. So you're basically keeping them up to date as things are progressing with your loved one and their care. But ultimately, it does come down to you and how you are managing your stress. Now, here on this slide, you see a whole list of suggested ways of managing stress. Outsourcing. As much as you can, I really encourage caregivers to continuously try to allocate responsibilities to others, because it means that your burden will be reduced. Also, we all have heard this idea of exercise and diet. And if that's not your strong point and you need to start afresh, my suggestion is start slow. Because if you sort of say to yourself, I'm going to do 2 miles walk each day, you may feel that that's just insurmountable and you just never get started. So start slow. Also give yourself time out to do some of the hobbies and interests that you enjoy. And you see here that I have vegging out in front of the TV is okay. And I bring that up because there was one caregiver who said to me, I feel guilty. I sit there in front of the TV. And my point to him was, well, if it helps you relax, then that's something you need to do. Time out, know when to step away. So if you're working with a care recipient, maybe your spouse, maybe your parent, and your rage and your anger is building to a point where you feel like you're going to blow, that's the cue. You need to step away. For many, talking to a therapist, a friend, a faith-based leader can also be extremely helpful. One caregiver told me about the yelling out her frustration was helpful, and she did it in the car. The final one is caregiver support groups. And that's one that I myself, maybe I'm biased because I run caregiver support groups, but I'm a big proponent of. And the reason being is it gives you an opportunity to be with like-minded people who really understand each other. And it gives you an opportunity to voice exactly how you're feeling without a sense of guilt or a sense of, I really shouldn't be saying this. And by just talking through your emotions, that in itself can be extremely helpful and de-stressing. And another thing is that a lot of these caregiver support groups are wonderful in terms of giving each other ideas, giving each other resources. They may share the different agencies that they have used in the community. And last week, one of the questions that I didn't get to address was someone had asked, where can I go to find a caregiver support group? Go to your senior center or your council on aging. They will likely be running caregiver support groups. On this slide here, you just have some very specific suggestions for ways of managing stress. And these were taken from Springwell. And Springwell is an area agency on aging. And Springwell serves Newton and many of the surrounding cities. So maybe some of these specific ones might be helpful to you. But remember, in terms of developing coping mechanisms around your stress, often they are very individualized and you need to figure out what works for you. Now I want to turn to community-based services and resources that caregivers can make use of. And the point of these services is to give you, the caregiver, a break or respite. And these types of respites can be arranged by the afternoon, the morning, by hours, by different days of the week. There's a lot of flexibility. And the way to look at these home community-based services is services that are provided within the home, and then also services that are provided within the community, as in outside the home. So firstly, in terms of in-home services, you have the home health care. This is medicalized care. You may get it through nursing care or physical therapy. You can also have home care or personal care assistance. And this is non-medical in nature. And this might be, for example, light house cleaning, cooking, helping with some of the activities of daily living, such as eating, toileting, dressing, and so on. There's also companionship. And that one is sometimes overlooked, but it's an important one because if the older loved one is there by themselves, You're trying to provide them as much support as possible, but you obviously need to get on with your own things. That individual, that care recipient may feel quite lonely and isolated. So just having a companion there to ensure that they can continue doing some of the things that they enjoy is really helpful and really important. As we all realize through COVID, we know what it's like to feel isolated. So reducing that through companionship can be extremely helpful for not only the care recipient, but also for you, the caregiver. There, as I said, there's also respite that can be organized through services in the community, and that is through adult day centers. And adult day centers are really a place where you can have your loved one go to. They can stay for 5 to 6 hours per day, and they will provide meals, they'll provide activities, and depending on the level of support and care that your loved one may need, will dictate the type of adult care that is suitable for them. So if they're fairly independent, then social care. If they need some help with some health related issues or some activities of daily living, such as maybe they need help with going to the bathroom, maybe they need some help with eating, then the adult day healthcare may be more appropriate. And then more recently, over the last many years, dementia daycares are now starting to be available in the community. Skilled nursing facility can also be arranged in such a way that you have your loved ones stay at the nursing facility for either some days, maybe some weeks, maybe up to a month. The cost is fairly high. In the Newton area, I believe the cost now lies around $300 to $400 per day. And yes, that is expensive. But look at it this way, if it's a way of helping you, the caregiver, reduce your stress level by getting this break, then I would argue it's money well spent. Ultimately, it's so important that you are at least aware of the services and resources available to you so that you can make use of them. You want to ensure that you remain as effective caregiver as possible without losing sight of who you are and what your needs are. Many people, when they decide to hire someone for a home, for care in the home, they are unsure about how to go about hiring an aide. And I found that many describe how it can take them multiple attempts to get the right hire. And this may be because in the beginning, you may not be getting people that work well with your loved one, whether it be your parent, whether it be your spouse, or it may be that the agency that you're working with may not be the best choice, and that you should maybe move on and find a different agency. And I tend to say the latter is true if the agency that you're working with is just not being responsive in terms of your specific requests or needs. In other words, they just don't seem to be really able to fulfill what it is that you're asking for. In terms of getting an aide who hopefully is the best fit for your loved one, it can be really helpful to think through some questions that you can use to screen for an aide. But before you come up with these questions, I encourage people to really think about who is your loved one, who is your spouse, who is your parent. Think of them in terms of what is their personality, what are their interests, what are their specific needs. Because remember, the aide must be able to help with those specific needs. Also, what kind of person you as the caregiver, what kind of person do you work best with? Do you need the type of aide that can think on their own 2 feet and just get on with it? Or are you the type of person that you would rather that the aide comes to you at every so often and checks in and says, I'm thinking of doing this, I'm thinking of doing that. So it really, well, are you a hands-on or hands-off type of person? Can also be a good thing to think about as you're trying to find the best possible aid. On this slide here, you have some suggested questions that you can use as you're going about this. And I do hope that some of these questions are helpful. But the two main things to first reflect on are who is the client and what type of person do you best work with. One thing before I move on to the next slide, I will just point out is there is a staff shortage. It is hard to find people. And it is important that as soon as you think you may need assistance with an aide in the home, start reaching out, because you may find it harder to find someone than initially expected. But unfortunately, this is the situation in elder care at the moment. It is hard to find people. So again, I cannot stress enough how important it is for you to consider the emotional drain that caregivers can have. And that's why it is so important to reach out for help from others. And I keep repeating this to caregivers that I work with. And there are many different avenues, as you can see here on this slide, that you can consider when it comes to thinking about who to reach out to. So the ones that I've already referenced are certainly family, hopefully friends, maybe neighbors, but also maybe your religious or spiritual group can be really helpful here. And as I already indicated, caregiver support groups. And I do just want to give a shout out to the Newton Senior Center. They run caregiver support groups. One that's in person, and I believe it's the first Tuesday of every month. And that is run by the Newton Senior Center's social worker, Emily Cool. The other one is every third Tuesday of the month, and that is a remote group. And we meet in the evenings from 6 to 7:30, and that is a group that I run. It is free. If you're interested, please reach out to Emily Cole, and she can help you with finding the best option for you, whether it should be in person or one that is remote. And then also definitely learn about the respite opportunities that are available in your community. And again, the point is that you need to try as much as possible to ask for help, because you want to minimize the burden that you are taking on. And what I found through my research is that generally people like to be asked for help, but they often need to be told exactly how they can help you. And I think many of us have heard the refrain, let me know if I can be of any help. And that is when you, as the caregiver, the main caregiver, the primary caregiver, that is when you need to say, oh, thank you so much. I need help with, and then really be specific about exactly what you need help with. Because remember, the people offering help, they don't know what your daily life is like. They don't know the gaps that need to be filled. You need to help them to better be able to support you. On this slide here, you also have a numerous recommended online resources. And these are the ones that I have turned to myself, and I've heard that many other people find them very helpful. And again, I will repeat myself, and that is pay attention to how you are doing. If you burn out in terms of physical and or emotional well-being, you risk not being there when support is needed. not only to your loved one who needs your care, but also to other people in your life, maybe your children, maybe your extended family, maybe your workplace. Ultimately, it's so important to know that there is help to the caregiver in the community. And the key point is to make use of it. Now, this final part of my presentation, I hope to give you some pointers about how you might get to a better place in terms of how you're coping as a caregiver. Firstly, it's about figuring out what is your biggest challenge. I've heard that many will say that they feel like they're being stretched in many different directions. Also, that they may be having a hard time accepting seeing their parent or loved one become increasingly frail and dependent. That certainly is a huge emotional challenge for a lot of people, because it often can make you feel powerless and vulnerable. And as I already addressed, others talk about the continued challenges and conflicts that they may have with other family members. Whatever your situation is, it's really important that you label it, and then that gives you an opportunity to try to work on it. And that might be, as I've already indicated, seeking out professional counseling. It may be reaching out to other family members, and it may ultimately be figuring out how you yourself can best continue in the role that you're in, because sometimes reaching out to those siblings just causes more stress than not reaching out to them. Also, it's important to recognize what is most important to you and your loved one. Ultimately, my argument is that time is so meaningful, and reminiscence can be a powerful tool that gives you an opportunity to review and discuss past experiences. And I will say, to be quite honest, in terms of my own mom, who passed away 13 years, I, to this day, still regret that I didn't have more conversations with her about events that only she could talk about, only she had the answer to. You may also need to figure out some good coping mechanisms. And I hope that some of the ones that I've discussed in this presentation might be helpful to you. But remember, sometimes it might be a little bit of trial and error, because often what I find is that coping mechanisms are very individualized. Some work for one person, some don't work for another person. And finally, please recognize that this is a phase of your life which may require some adjustment and acceptance, and that it can take some time to find that place where you feel that you are in a place where you can be okay, and that you can feel that you can at least address the needs that you have. So getting to acceptance can be a very important part of getting to a better place. So maybe you're not feeling quite as relaxed as this frog here, but I do hope that at least that I've been able to address some of your questions, some of your concerns, and maybe possibly help you to work a little bit on your stress level and to help you reduce it. And now I'm going to take questions. So let me look at some of the questions in the Q&A. So one question here is, I'm curious for the ones who have no family, for example, widow, childless, no relatives, don't want to burden friends. What options will this person have? Is there a support group for such a population? And thank you for that question. And that is certainly a question that is very relevant to many people. And these, some of sometimes we label them soul ages. And the best advice I have for people who do not have others that they feel comfortable reaching out to, or who simply don't have other people to reach out to, is that you really find out what's available in your community. You really take the time to reach out to your senior center. And one thing that for anywhere where you live, whether it be in Newton or in any other town or state, go to your senior center and find out the resources and the information that they can provide. And I think if you haven't already done so, you'll be very pleasantly surprised about the amount of support that they can provide. But again, addressing the person who's the sole ager is really imperative that you do as much homework as possible to find out what's available in your community. Also, reach out to other people who may also be sole agers. Find out what they might be doing. You might be surprised that there are other people who have children but don't feel that they can rely on these children. They also are grappling with this question. So try to open up a little bit about some of your own thoughts and concerns. And you may find that there are plenty of other people in your vicinity who have this exact question. Also, don't be shy about pointing out your specific concerns to your social worker at the senior center. They again can help you steer you in some direction that might be able to provide you some help. But the more planning that you do, the better you can adjust and find resources that you can make use of when the time comes. Will this recording be shared with everyone who is registered? That's another question. Yes, this is being recorded, so you will be able to review this whole presentation again. A third question is, parent has the money but does not want to spend the money on aids and outside help. How to have boundaries and enforce them while keeping safety in mind. So yes, this is definitely a challenge for many people because the cost of elder care is expensive. People worry about spending the money on their own care because for many, they also want to try and ensure that as much money can be transferred to their children. But if you are someone who is needing that care and you're hesitating about using money on you yourself, think a little bit about that it's important that you do as much as possible that can support you in your own home for as long as possible, because you want to delay having to go into possibly assisted or nursing home for as long as possible, because that is far more expensive. Also, again, addressing that individual who's hesitant about using money on support services for themselves, that think also about that it is a way of reducing the stress level among family members when they know that you are being well taken care of. Setting boundaries is challenging for many. Sometimes a little bit of tough love needs to be conveyed to that family member. So again, let's say that the dynamic is that the parent is demanding more support from their children than the children can feasibly give. The child or children may need to explain to the parents, we love you, but we do, simply because of time constraints, geographic constraints, we can only give so much. The situation can certainly also be reversed, where the children want to step in as much as possible. Maybe they're stepping in too much, and boundaries are overstepped from the perspective of the parent. again, you need to express your own opinions, express your gratitude and realization that you understand they love you and they want to support you, but that you need to run your own life. Communication in all of this is key. Yes, you will get access to the slides through the presentation that will be put up on the website. Another question, what if your loved one refuses help in the home and needs it for bathing, etc.? When does the caregiver make these decisions and just get help while respecting a loved one's opinion? So again, it's a matter of conveying to the individual who is refusing the help. And I have dealt with many of these situations. It's a matter of helping that individual who's refusing the help to make them realize that you only have as much to give as you can give. And that if they don't get this external help, such as in your example, in this question about bathing, they can experience a fall, they can have a slip. The result can be that they have a fall and therefore end up in a hospital. And from there on, they may be taken to a rehab and then end up in a nursing home. Again, it becomes a point of helping the individual who's refusing the help to understand that by getting these lower level supports, and often less expensive, can prevent that potential fall. And therefore, by putting in these support services within the home, can make it so that you can age in place for as long as possible, for as safe as possible. And also, again, you are putting less stress and worry on your family members by demonstrating that you're willing to help yourself. Another question, and this will be the last question. Parents discharged from rehab and told 72-hour care due to forgetfulness and impulsivity. Assisted living costs less than in-house care, but greater than income. What to do? Refuses to go into savings and capital. Limited options. So yes, it can be a point where if you are faced with having to have 24-hour care, that can end up being more expensive than needing going into assisted living. And there is a calculation that you need to do in terms of figuring out at the end of the day which option is less expensive. A financial advisor might be helpful for you in terms of calculating those costs. I realize I may not have addressed your questions fully because each case is always so complex and individualized. If you do have any questions that you feel like I didn't address fully, or maybe that I misunderstood, please realize you can always reach out to me via my email address, julie@helpmyagingparents.net. I'll be happy to address any questions. I'm afraid we're now at the end of this webinar, but thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. These presentations have been super educational. I know our attendees have learned so much, and we would like to thank our attendees for attending. And we want to inform you that the recording for this session will be available on our YouTube website in a week or so, and we'll be reaching out with a follow-up email with the slides included. Thank you. Take care, everyone.